Well, we've heard that great leaders start with why, right? But great leaders also start with who. Start with who. Who are we serving? Pablo Picasso had this great quote, which is, "The meaning of life is to find your gift, and the purpose of life is to give it away." The meaning of life is to find your gift, and the purpose of life is to give it away. Our job as leaders, and what it means to lead with purpose, is ultimately to tap into people's gifts, to understand what makes them come alive. We talked about that in the last habit. But then to switch the spotlight, to shift it to who are we trying to serve, and making sure that that idea never really gets lost. I talked about Groupon and our experience with Groupon. And one of the things I'll share with you is that when we first started the company, we were completely obsessed with small businesses. Our job was to serve the small business. So if you walk through the early halls of Groupon, what you would find is pictures, photos of the small businesses we were serving. We were constantly telling stories about the people we were serving. But as we became a bigger company, we started to take on investors, and eventually we went public. It turned from the stories into the numbers. We were completely focused on the numbers. We were focused on profit. We were focused on bottom line. We were focused on efficiencies. Now, the thing about that is that when things are good, numbers can be fine. People will pay attention to numbers. But when things get bad, when things get tough, when we go through our trials and tribulations, numbers don't matter as much anymore. It's stories that really fuel people's purpose. Right? So when we shifted from purpose, when we shifted from story to the numbers, we lost our sense of purpose. We lost what it was that we were actually doing this for. And when things started to turn tough, a lot of talent left the building. A lot of people left the company. Okay, so the best companies are the ones that not just focus on who we're serving, but they keep the focus there. I learned this years later when I started my company. I started a company called Rise, and what we did was one-on-one nutrition coaching, one-on-one health coaching over your mobile phone. And I remember I was out there pitching investors, and I got rejected over and over and over again. I got rejected by over a dozen investors in a row. But in one of the meetings, an investor asked me a question that completely changed things around for me. And what he asked me is, why are you doing this? Like, who are you doing this for? And I told him a story. I said, the reason that this company matters to me is because my dad was in my age when he was in his mid-40s. A photo of here, and this is me with a bow tie behind him. When my father was about this age, he had an emergency triple bypass surgery. He was rushed to the hospital. By the time I was out of school, he was already on the operating table. And I remember more than anything else the drive from the hospital back home. So days later, after he was discharged, I remember that for the first time, he was sitting in the passenger seat. My mom was driving the car. And I had never seen that before. My dad always drove. And he was sitting there in the passenger seat, and he looked so old. He looked so frail. And I remember thinking to myself, like, come on, Dad. You've got to be strong again. You've got to be a dad again. And I had no idea if that was going to happen. But thankfully, he turned his life around. He started to eat better. He started to exercise. He started to take care of himself. And that was over 30 years ago. Doctors had no idea if he was going to live another 10 years, but it's been over 30 years, and I just talked to him this morning. He walked 3 miles. But he had a lot of help. He had doctors, he had nurses, he had people who cared for him. He also had the help of a health coach. Insurance kicked in and helped him pay for somebody who could help him be accountable, who could adjust his exercise, adjust his sleep, and really kind of help him create a better life for himself. And I wanted nothing more than to take that type of service and to make that accessible, to make that affordable for other people. So taking us back to that moment with that investor, I tell him that story. And he looks at me and he says, "Why didn't you tell that story inside the room?" And I said, well, because I was pitching a business, right? I'm pitching like a new startup, a new business, so I've got to focus on the numbers. I've got to focus on the market size. I've got to focus on total addressable market, all the business metrics. And he said, yeah, but here's the thing. When you tell that story, you become a different person. When you share that story, you come alive in a brand new way. And so why don't you tell that story, and then you can get into the numbers. Then you can get into market size. I made that one simple shift. That one simple shift. I started telling my dad's story at the beginning of every time I met an investor, every time I met a partner. We were able to raise millions of dollars of funding. We were able to partner with the White House. Apple named us Best App of the Year because I would share that story first. That is the power of what it is that you do here in this room, because you do shape people's lives, you save people's lives, and you give people hope. Telling those stories, making sure those stories are front and center, not just for you, but for the people around you, is our job as leaders.